The scream tore through the cold stone corridors, a raw, guttural sound that sliced the ancient air. Imagine it, a woman, dragged by her hair, her face contorted, echoing off palace walls that saw centuries of silent atrocities. She wasn't a traitor. She hadn't conspired against the king. Her only offense was to displease the absolute lord of Mesopotamia. What happened to her in the hours that followed was never etched into the triumphant reliefs now displayed in museums around the world. But it was there, scrawled onto forgotten clay tablets, buried deep in history's basements. Punishments so brutal, even the Assyrian scribes hesitated to describe them with clarity, opting for a chilling administrative shorthand. Have you ever wondered why official history celebrates the grandeur of empires, yet falls silent on the hidden horrors within royal harems? Why public records exalt military conquests, but obscure the true fate of the women who inhabited those opulent palaces?
Assyria, one of antiquity's most formidable empires, terrorized the Middle East for centuries with its military might. Its kings were revered as demigods, intermediaries between heaven and earth, their power absolute. But behind the towering walls of Nineveh and Ashur, far from the gaze of the populace and official chroniclers, lay a system of control as sophisticated as it was cruel. This was a code of punishment applied exclusively to the women of the royal household, wives, concubines, and servants who populated the imperial harem. These were not merely physical chastisements, they were meticulously calculated to dismantle identity, to strip away dignity, to transform living beings into stark, unwavering examples of absolute obedience. And perhaps most disturbingly, many were sanctioned by religious law, presented as the direct will of the gods, a necessary purification to maintain cosmic order.
What do we truly think of civilizations that built architectural wonders upon pillars of silent terror? The official narrative portrays Assyrian kings as efficient administrators, ruthless warriors, and devout servants of their deities. The reliefs adorning their palaces depict kings hunting lions, subjugating enemies, receiving tribute. Women, when they appear, are decorative figures, idealized queens in formal poses, holding flowers or cups, symbols of fertility and abundance. History books briefly mention royal harems, often describing them as spaces of luxury and privilege, where hundreds of women lived in comfort, competing for the monarch's attention. Official archaeology prefers to focus on architectural achievements, vast libraries of cuneiform tablets, ingenious irrigation systems. But documents unearthed in excavations at Nineveh, Ashur, and Kalhu tell a starkly different story.
According to administrative tablets discovered in the northwest palace of Kalhu, dating to the 9th century before Christ, specific officials existed whose sole function was to oversee punishments inflicted upon harem women. These documents, only translated in the late 20th century, unveil a bureaucratic system of control and retribution. They contain lists of infractions, chilling descriptions of penalties, and records of women who simply vanish from royal inventories without explanation. One Assyrian legal text, known as the Middle Assyrian Code, preserved in fragments of clay tablets, dedicates entire sections to the punishments applicable to women. There it is written, with the characteristic administrative chill of Mesopotamian scribes, that a harem woman who disrespected royal protocol could have her breasts amputated. A concubine accused of malicious gossip was to have her tongue torn out.
Secondary wives caught in unauthorized conversations could be branded on the face with a hot iron. These were not isolated excesses of deranged tyrants. These were legal procedures sanctioned by law executed by designated officials, and meticulously recorded in administrative documents. The horror was institutionalized, normalized, and integrated into the everyday functioning of imperial power. Even more unsettling, many of these punishments were justified as religious purification rituals, deemed necessary to appease the wrath of the gods and maintain the empire's cosmic order. The royal Assyrian harem was not merely a space of reclusion, it was a gilded prison governed by invisible rules, where every gesture, every word, every glance could result in devastating consequences. Women lived under the constant surveillance of eunuchs and guards who reported any deviation in behavior to their superiors. The infractions considered punishable were absurdly broad.
Their only perceived strategy for survival was absolute invisibility, to not be noticed, not to be remembered, to exist no more than minimally required. But even invisibility offered no guarantee of safety. Among the most common punishments applied to harem women were mutilations. These were not the grand mutilations of war enemies celebrated in public reliefs, but smaller deformations, calculated to destroy dignity without ending life. The Middle Assyrian Code prescribes with bureaucratic precision: if a harem woman raises her hand against another of superior status, her fingers shall be cut off. If she is accused of spreading rumors about the king, her tongue shall be pierced with hot needles. If she attempts to flee, her feet shall be branded with a hot iron, so all may know of her transgression.
Archaeological excavations in areas identified as Royal Seven Cemeteries have revealed female skeletons bearing signs of trauma consistent with these descriptions. Amputated fingers, skulls with perforations suggesting cranial torture, bodies buried in positions indicating violent death. Yet they were interred within the palace complexes, far from public burial grounds, invisible to collective memory. A scribe from the 6th century before Christ, on a tablet found in the royal archives of Nineveh, records almost casually: on the 12th day of the month of Nisanu, the concubine Mulitsu received 20 strokes of the rod for looking out a window during the royal procession. On the 15th day, she was branded on the shoulder as prescribed by law. On the 20th day, she was removed from the main harem. Removed, a clean administrative word. But what did it truly mean to be removed? Subsequent records never mention this woman again.
She simply vanishes from documented existence, like so many others. The marks were not merely punishments, they were permanent signs etched into the flesh, transforming the woman into a living example for others. A concubine with a face scarred by a hot iron carried with her for her entire life the physical remembrance of her transgression and the constant warning that royal power tolerated no deviations. Yet, perhaps most disturbing, were the punishments disguised as religious rituals. Mesopotamian religion dictated that the female body was inherently impure, a source of spiritual contamination that required constant control and purification. Assyrian priests developed elaborate purification rituals, especially for the women of the royal harem. These rituals, described in tablets of incantations and religious procedures, involved prolonged fasts, isolation in dark cells, baths in corrosive substances, and ritual flagellations.
A menstruating woman was considered so impure that her mere touch could contaminate sacred objects and bring misfortune upon the king. During these periods, women were confined to separate areas of the harem, forbidden any human contact, and subjected to cleansing rituals that frequently caused permanent physical harm, An Assyrian medical text preserved in the library of Ashurbanipal in Nineveh describes treatments to purify the female womb that included the insertion of caustic substances. The stated purpose was to make the woman fertile and pleasing to the gods. The practical result was excruciating pain and frequently permanent sterility. But this was presented as a divine blessing, as spiritual care, as concern for the cosmic well-being of the empire. Women were taught from a young age that their bodies were inherently sinful, that pain was necessary purification, that resisting the rituals was to defy the gods themselves.
As its historian Karen Ria Nemet-Nejat, an expert on daily life in ancient Mesopotamia, wrote, "Control over the female body in Assyrian society was not merely political or social, it was cosmological. The submission of women was seen as necessary to maintain the divine order of the universe. And so terror was sanctified, violence became liturgy, suffering transformed into devotion. Not all women within the harem's confines were wives of status or favored concubines. The vast majority were servants, slaves captured from conquered lands, women offered as tribute from subjugated territories. These were the most vulnerable, the most utterly invisible, their fates rarely recorded with any clarity. Administrative documents tell us hundreds of women entered the royal harems each year, yet the records of their departure are eerily scarce, riddled with unsettling gaps. Where did these women go when they aged, when they fell ill, when they ceased to be useful or desirable?
Some ancient texts hint at redistribution, perhaps to temples transformed into religious servants. Others suggest they were sent to distant rural properties, confined to imperial fans, condemned to a lifetime of forced labor. But for countless others, the records simply cease to mention them, as if they had never existed. Archaeological excavations within Assyrian palace complexes have uncovered disturbing evidence. Pits and ditches revealed unusual concentrations of female bones, buried without ritual care, piled in layers that suggest mass disposal. Official archaeology often shies away from sensationalist speculation, but the data is deeply disquieting. These were young women, many showing signs of violent death or extreme neglect, discarded like refuse within the very palace grounds that were supposed to house if not protect them. A fragment of a letter sent by a harem official to King Ashurbanipal and found in the archives of Nineveh offers a chilling glimpse.
Lord of the four corners, as commanded, the 17 were removed during the new moon. The priests performed the appropriate purifications. The harem is now in compliance with divine decrees. 17. No names, no explanation of what removed truly meant. Just a number in an administrative report, reducing entire lives to a single inventory line. Did these women have time to feel fear? Did they comprehend what was happening as they were led away? Or did they believe until the very end that these rituals were indeed purification, that their suffering was the will of the gods, that the king knew what was best for them, for the cosmos? What makes the history of the Assyrian harem particularly devastating isn't solely the brutality of the punishments. It's the intricate ideological structure that underpinned them.
These horrors were not the chaotic excesses of mad tyrants. They were codified state policies, justified by religion, executed by bureaucrats, accepted as the natural order of things. The women who endured these punishments were not considered victims of injustice. Quite the contrary, they were presented as examples of justice functioning correctly. Their mutilations were proof that the legal system was operating as it should.
Their suffering was evidence that the gods were being honored, their wrath appeased. Their ultimate disappearance, their invisibility, was a sign that cosmic order remained intact, undisturbed by any deviation. The historian Mark van de Meeroop, a specialist in Assyrian history, observed a crucial point. Systematic violence against women in ancient Mesopotamian societies was not seen as violence. It was seen as the maintenance of order.
The very concept of injustice simply did not apply when the victim was considered property, when the aggressor was deemed divine, when suffering was interpreted as a cosmic necessity. This, then, is the profound, disturbing lesson of the Assyrian harem. Absolute power rarely needs to justify its atrocities when it can successfully redefine them as virtues. It transforms brutality into law, violence into sacred ritual, oppression into devout religious observance. This pattern, alas, is not unique to ancient Mesopotamia. How many times throughout human history have systems of oppression been sanctified, presented as the natural order, defended as divine will? How often has the suffering of vulnerable groups been institutionalized, normalized, and rendered invisible by the very society that inflicts it? The Spanish Inquisition called its tortures the salvation of souls. Slavery was defended as the civilization of primitive peoples.
Modern totalitarian regimes euphemistically described concentration camps as re-education centers. The language shifts, the justifications adapt, but the underlying mechanism remains chillingly consistent: absolute power finding ever new ways to sanctify its own horrors. The women of the Assyrian harem had no voice to tell their stories. They left no written testimonies. There were no recorded revolts, no preserved manifestos, no cries echoing through the millennia to reach us. They were silenced in life and forgotten in death. Yet their stories are there, etched onto cold clay tablets, waiting for someone willing to truly read them, not as mere archaeological curiosities, not as exotic tales from a distant past, but as an unsettling mirror reflecting human nature when power operates without limits. The greatness of empires has always been measured by their visible conquests: monumental temples, invincible armies, libraries overflowing with knowledge.
But perhaps we should measure civilizations not just by what they flaunt, but by what they choose to hide, by the horrors they consider necessary, by the suffering they normalize. The Assyrian harem was a tiny territory within a vast empire, an invisible space on maps of conquest. But there, within those silent corridors, the true nature of absolute power revealed itself. It wasn't merely the capacity to dominate external enemies. It was the absolute will to completely control those considered property, to shatter dignities, to erase identities, to transform human beings into living examples of utter obedience. And all of this was done in the name of order, in the name of the gods, in the name of civilization itself. The clay tablets found in Nineveh survived because they were baked, hardened in the very inferno that consumed the city in 612 before Christ. The Assyrian Empire crumbled, its mighty walls fell, its kings were forgotten for centuries.
Yet those words, etched into resilient clay, endured. They waited 3,000 years to be read again, a testament to what history itself seemed to insist on preserving, despite our collective preference to forget. So I ask you, as this chilling account fades into the darkness, have these mechanisms of control, of silencing,
of sanctified violence truly remained buried in the ruins of ancient Mesopotamia? Or have they merely learned to employ different languages, to hide within more subtle structures, to operate through systems so normalized that we no longer recognize them as violence? How many invisible harems still exist, disguised as respectable institutions, protected by bureaucratic language, justified by higher necessities? And when we look back at the past, experiencing a comfortable, safe horror in judging dead civilizations, are we truly seeing?
Or are we merely shielding ourselves from recognizing the very same patterns operating all around us, invisible because we have been taught not to look, silent because we have learned not to listen? What do you think about that? The historical accounts, often shaped by those in power, consistently focus on grand narratives, the rise and fall of dynasties, epic battles, magnificent architectural feats. They are designed to awe, to inspire, and, crucially, to sanitize. The dirty laundry of an empire, especially the treatment of its most vulnerable, is meticulously scrubbed from the official record, relegated to forgotten fragments, or deliberately obscured. Consider the meticulous records kept by the Assyrians themselves. Their scribes were renowned for their precision, their dedication to documentation. Every tribute received, every enemy slain, every royal decree was carefully recorded.
Yet, when it came to the daily lives and, more significantly, the often brutal fates of the women within the royal palaces, that precision often dissolved into vague euphemisms. Removed, purified, no longer an inventory. These phrases, seemingly innocuous, masked unspeakable realities. The silence around these women's stories wasn't accidental. It was a deliberate act of erasure, a conscious effort to prevent any counter-narrative from emerging, to acknowledge the systemic abuse. The institutionalized terror would have undermined the very legitimacy of the divine kings and the cosmic order they claim to uphold. How could a king be a benevolent intermediary between gods and men if his own household was a site of such calculated cruelty? The power dynamics at play were absolute. The king, as a quasi-divine figure, was beyond reproach. His actions, by definition, were righteous. Any suffering inflicted was thus not wrong, but necessary.
This ideological framework was hammered into every member of Assyrian society, from the highest noble to the lowliest servant. For the women of the harem, this meant an internal as well as external subjugation. They were taught to believe in their own inherent impurity, in the divine necessity of their suffering. This psychological conditioning was arguably as potent as the physical punishments. It fostered an environment where resistance was unthinkable, where even the thought of defiance was framed as an affront to the gods themselves. This deep-seated belief system made it easier for officials to carry out their duties without moral qualms, for priests to sanction barbaric rituals under the guise of piety, and for the women themselves to internalize their plight as an unavoidable, even deserved fate. The comfort and luxury often ascribed to royal harems in popular imagination is a dangerous myth.
While some high-ranking wives where concubines might have enjoyed material wealth, it came at an exorbitant price: their freedom, their dignity, and often their very lives. The glittering facade of opulence merely served to mask a system of total control, a gilded cage designed to break the human spirit. These women were rarely individuals in the eyes of the empire. They were assets, commodities to be managed, controlled, and when deemed inconvenient, disposed of.
Their value was tied directly to their perceived utility to the king and the state, their fertility, their beauty, their absolute obedience. Once these qualities diminished, their fate became even more precarious. The stories gleaned from these fragments of clay are not just about ancient Assyria. They are universal narratives about power, vulnerability, and the human capacity for both cruelty and resilience. They force us to confront uncomfortable questions about how societies define justice, purity, and order.
Và nó serve as a stark reminder that the official histories, the ones carved in stone and celebrated in museums, often tell only half the story, leaving the true cost of empire buried beneath layers of glorious prose and triumphant imagery. The true legacy of the Assyrian harem lies not in its luxury, but in its terror, not in its beauty, but in its calculated brutality. It's a testament to how easily fear can be woven into the fabric of daily life, how effortlessly cruelty can be rationalized, and how effectively the powerful can erase the voices of those they deem inconsequential. It challenges us to look beyond the grandiosity of power and to seek out the quiet, desperate whispers of those it chose to silence. The implications of the Assyrian harem's forgotten stories stretch far beyond the ancient world. They compel us to examine our own present, to dissect the systems of control and subjugation that persist, often cloaked in modern, more palatable language.
The uncomfortable truth is that the fundamental dynamics of power, privilege, and the systematic suppression of vulnerable groups have not fundamentally vanished with the fall of empires. They have merely evolved, adapted, and found new masks to wear. Think about the bureaucratic language that still pervades our institutions. Phrases like restructuring personnel, optimizing resources, or managing human capital can, in certain contexts, echo the chilling detachment of the Assyrian scribes who wrote removed or no longer in inventory. While the context and consequences are drastically different, the dehumanizing potential of administrative language, stripping individuals of their unique stories and reducing them to data points, remains a powerful tool for obscuring uncomfortable truths. We still see the pervasive influence of ideology, whether religious, political, or economic, used to justify systems that cause suffering.
When economic hardship is presented as a natural market correction, or social inequality as a meritocratic outcome, we witness echoes of the ancient justifications. These narratives, much like the Assyrian priests declaring suffering a divine purification, serve to normalize and sanitize systemic problems, shifting blame from structures of power onto individuals or inescapable forces. The control over women's bodies and choices, though manifesting differently, continues in various forms across the globe. From restrictive laws on reproductive rights to societal pressures on appearance and behavior, the notion of the female body as a site of moral or social control, requiring purification or regulation, has unfortunately proven remarkably resilient. While no longer involving hot irons or amputations, the psychological and societal pressures can be profoundly damaging, eroding autonomy and dignity in insidious ways. The invisibility of suffering is another recurring theme.
In our highly connected world, it might seem impossible to truly silence voices. Yet, how many stories of marginalized communities, of workers exploited, of individuals facing systemic discrimination remain unheard or deliberately ignored? The sheer volume of information can itself become a form of obfuscation, allowing critical truths to be buried beneath a deluge of less challenging content. The ancient Assyrian elites celebrated their grand achievements while actively suppressing the narrative of their internal cruelties. Today, we often prioritize visible metrics of success, economic growth, technological advancement, national prestige, while sometimes overlooking the human cost, the environmental degradation, or the social inequities that might underpin such progress. The grand narrative can still overshadow the quiet suffering of those at the bottom of the societal hierarchy.
The most potent lesson from the Assyrian harem isn't just about ancient history, it's a cautionary tale about the human condition and the enduring temptation of absolute power to define its own morality. It teaches us that true civilization is not merely measured by monumental architecture or military might, but by its capacity for empathy, its commitment to justice, and its willingness to protect its most vulnerable members rather than exploit or discard them. It's a call to critical thinking, urging us to question official narratives, to seek out the hidden stories, and to listen to the voices that history has tried to silence. It's a reminder that true understanding requires looking beyond the polished facade into the shadows where uncomfortable truths often reside. Because if we don't learn these lessons, if we fail to recognize the enduring patterns of dehumanization and justified cruelty, we risk perpetuating them in new, perhaps more subtle, but no less destructive forms.
The ghosts of those forgotten women, removed from the Assyrian registers, continue to whisper through the millennia, urging us to be vigilant, to challenge power, and to never mistake silence for consent, or institutionalized cruelty for cosmic order. Their stories, once buried under rubble and euphemisms, are now unearthed, serving not as a judgment of a distant past, but as a mirror reflecting our own human journey, reminding us that the fight for dignity and justice is an eternal one, demanding constant awareness and unwavering courage.